back with another timely seminar about the global retreat of liberal democracy. We are part of Pakistan Progressive Forum, which is a forum developed in North America to educate and to reactivate the old comrades, the old friends, old progressive people and newcomers, everybody in North America especially and in Europe, so that we can organize people to uh, project a picture of Pakistan, that there is progressive thought and there are people who are struggling to develop a progressive, people-oriented society in Pakistan, and they are trying to do whatever they can sitting overseas to help all the progressive movements in Pakistan. We have made a very active website where people can interact with each other, people can get involved, and through seminars, through groundwork in Pakistan, we are trying to help establish or re-establish the left movement in Pakistan. Today's seminar is a very timely exploration of the global retreat of liberal democracy amid rising authoritarianism and eroding democratic norms. This conference is bringing leading thinkers and young people who can shed light about why is liberal democracy on a retreat, why there is increasing authoritarianism, and why is it that left has not been able to play a significant role in this movement. I will give a little bit background about liberal thoughts. The liberal movement was going, liberal principles were going through from 12th century, from Magna Carta to different treaties in England. And then in the late 18th century, John Locke established a thorough definition of liberalism, in which, for him, the elementary principle for liberal movement were right to private property and the consent of the governed, which means that, people were giving up some of their rights to the government in order to gain a lot of securities and a lot of rights from the government. It argued that all the people are created equals, and in the times of monarchy, that monarchy and bloodline should not determine that who will rule the people. It should be people who should rule. Marx celebrated liberalism's achievements such as freedom of press, but he excoriated its fidelity to private property. Marx would praise the emancipatory value of certain liberal freedoms, like freedom of press, but he was very critical of that these property rights, these private property, that without eliminating that, there can't be the protection of basic rights in this. So we are here, we have a very distinguished panel with us. First of all, we have Sadia Abbas, who grew up in Karachi and Singapore, lives in New York, and spends as much as time she can in Greece and London. And she served as director of the Center of Europe.
Italy now.
Pardon?
Italy now.
Italy, okay. She's globetrotter. She has served as director of the Center for European Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick, and associate professor of postcolonial studies at Rutgers University. She's the author of At Freedom's Limit, Islam and the Postcolonial Predicament, winner of the MLA First Book Award and the novel The Empty Room, shortlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. She has written to numerous progressive journals and popular magazines. She has the left progressive outlook. She has written on Naya Dor, Open Democracy, etc. Then we have Danish Khan, who is the assistant professor of economics, and Andrew W. Mellon, fellow at Franklin and Marshall College. And then we have Raza Rumi, who does not really need much introduction. He is the resident scholar now in US, but he was very active in Pakistan. I think he is at Cornell right now and also teaches at City University of New York. So we will start in earnest with, I think, with Dr. Sadia, and we'll ask her, why do you think, and since you are also based in US, so I'm sure you see what is going on in US, that why is this liberal democracy is on decline, and why is it that left has been so out of touch with people that even all those problems which liberals created, because left, if you think about it, has always talked about, first of all, class struggle and economic struggle, but they are being blamed for, everybody says, oh, far left has brought this wokeism of this post-truth of all this thing about gender identity, even though we support people's right to make their own decisions, but our main struggle was and is about economic equality, class struggle. But we are being blamed for all this policies because of which there has been big setback in the US to progressive liberal forces.
You know, uh, when I was asked to participate, I was told that I was going to talk about the failure of liberal democracy, and um, uh, and that always becomes a very tricky and broad question for me, partly because I'm a critical theorist, and partly also because of the way you introduced the issue, because you took us back to John Locke and you took us to Marx, and then it became about all of liberalism and the history of liberalism, right? And if we go back there, then we've got a very long question to ask,
No,
right?
we'll
Because
be happy to listen to your current contemporary
right, but
criticism.
I can't, but I can't, but my point is that contemporary issue is very tied up to even that way of introducing the issue, right? Because in the sense that if we're talking about Marx's critique of Locke on private property, you could say that in some sense we're coming back to the current problematic of how the left is talking about how the left failed, even how the left is talking about how the left failed to to preempt what is happening in America with the far right, right? Think about how, say, Jacobin magazine is saying that the Democratic Party failed, or how Bernie Sanders is saying that we failed to address the working class struggle. I mean, there's all kinds of discourses taking place, even within the analysis on the political class, not just the theoretical class, right? And they're bleeding into each other in our circles, right? And so one answer, I think, quite simply is that, if we step back for a moment, we want to say, well, what do we mean by liberal democracy? Just simply, and do we actually think that there is, in the current moment, anywhere on the planet, a viable governmental alternative to liberal democracy, right? Do we actually have a governmental structure that we want, even if you're leftists and Marxists, that is actually in the actually existing world possible as an alternative to liberal democracy, number one, right? And even when we are leftists, like the Sanderites or the Jacobin people, I'm now talking about Jacobin magazine, or those who are quoting Marx as, Marx is dear to my heart. I can turn you to the shelf here with the Grundrisse and Capital and all of that, right? But even if we have a critique of the Locke on private property, what are we actually talking about when we say that we want something as an alternative, right?
Well,
So
there has been alternatives presented by
if
like
I,
Piketty.
sure, if I may
Okay,
complete,
sure, sure.
right? So my point is that, but given the current configuration in the United States, I mean, there's no, and not just in the United States, this is a global catastrophe, right? I mean, there is no getting around the fact that whatever was the structure of democracy in America, in the United States, and in Europe, is not only in decline, it might actually be in demise. I'm talking about Giorgia Meloni. I'm talking about what's happening in France. I'm talking about, what's happening across Europe, right? And one of the axes of that decline, right, is the response to immigrants, right? And authoritarianism right now is fundamentally predicated on the fear of the immigrant. There's no getting around it, right? And how it's been operationalized. And that has something, and so when we talk about the fear of that we're not catering to the working class, of course, one of the things that nobody's talking about when we use that in the United States, at least when we use that metric, is yes, but why is it then that so much of what's happening in America is about race and migration as well, right? And I say this as somebody who is fundamentally sympathetic to the fact that we have failed on the question of the working class. So I do think that one of the reasons that so to back up, I think one of the reasons that liberal democracy is in decline, and now I'm going to seem to be arguing against myself, is that neoliberalism has been on the rise, and that liberals and most of the so-called oppositional parties, and now you can take the Democrats, who neoliberalized starting with Clinton, right, and embraced the third way, or you can take Blair, who basically gut renovated and destroyed the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, and then you can sort of follow that across Europe as well. Neoliberalism became the norm in the 80s. And so there was, in fact, no alternative to neoliberalism. And what started happening within the parameters of liberal democracy, which was you get to choose between increasingly alternatives that don't look like alternatives. So to my analysis is that electoral politics and elections basically became a kind of hostage taking. You have no choice, and this is what the liberal side or the progressive side said, you have no choice. You have to vote for us, the Democrats said, or the Labour Party said, because look, the alternative is so much more ghastly, and the three protections that you have left under the welfare state are going to become 2.5 and then 1.5 and 0.5. And people increasingly just kept saying no. So every election that we've had recently has been basically people saying we want change. They don't know what they want, but basically what we've got now, I think in the West, right, where we still have the illusion or patina of democracy, which is basically, let's just say for a moment, and then I'll shut up, is that the working notion of democracy right now for us is, and I won't go into even the theory of liberal democracy, right, is that democracy right now in the West is the illusion that the majority of the population, increasingly a very, very slender majority, gets the illusion of freedom in choosing its leadership, right? And that slender majority is increasingly saying in each election, we do not like the incumbent and we are voting for change. And if you look at the patterns, that's what they're saying. So what's the decline? The decline is we don't like what
let me bring the other participants. Danish, do you agree that there is a liberal democracy's decline is because of the rise of fundamentalism, or even given of neoliberalism, and even given the confines of democratic politics? There used to be a much more people-oriented policies from in America, Democratic Party, or in US, Labour Party, in Canada, Liberal Party. But after Thatcher and Reagan, slowly the progressive wings, I won't say leftists, but they were progressive people. If you look in England, if you look in Democratic Party in the US, they gave up on fighting for people's rights, for people's getting some rights from the oligarchs. Like if you look in America, what happened after Reagan, you had and Bush, you had Bill Clinton, who tried to be more right than conservatives in a lot of policies. What he started were more destructive to poor people, where the shift was to the educated professional elites of the two coasts. And look at Midwest. Democratic Party lost their support in Midwest because traditional industries went away, but they did not make it easy for the people there to become more technically advanced. The education became, which was the main liberator for poor people, became so expensive. A lot of people now in US cannot even afford to go to university. So what do you think? What's the cause of the decline of liberal democracy? And do you agree with some of the points Sadia raised?
Yeah, thank you. Uh, I'll organize my thoughts into two broad conceptual categories. So I think if we want to understand the decline of liberal democracy, first let's stipulate what do we mean by decline, right? And again, I'm thinking out loud, and it hasn't been specified. I mean, what do we mean by decline, right? I think with the recent elections in the US and across the Europe, what we see, the pluralist political expression has been suppressed, and it has been labeled as maybe anti America if you disagree with the status quo or you critique politics on ideological lines. And again, the immigrants have been scapegoated and so forth. So that idea that a critique and pluralism of perspective is part and parcel of liberal democracy is under threat in some ways. Now, why we observe all of these factors in my reading, and again, as a political economist, I think there are two major factors. Of course, uh, I don't want to reduce it to these two factors. The politics, economics, culture, ideology over-determine each other. But the two factors, in my understanding, one is the rise in economic inequality, which Dr. Abbas spoke earlier with the rise of neoliberalism. And the second, I think, is the center left and moderate and centrist has exhausted themselves, right? They have not offered an alternative. So in terms of rise of inequality, since 90s, millions of people lost their jobs in the US and across the global north. And at the same time, the wealth of 1% has increased, right? And we heard this story many times. The rising inequality is an obvious factor here. According to recent Oxfam report, the billionaire class made around $5.7 billion per day. Their net wealth increased by that amount in the past year, whereas the working class wages have been stagnant, middle class has been also squeezed. So there is a discontent among large segment of population against this prevailing neoliberal economic order, which is, in very simple terms, is you use the term fundamentalist. I don't know in which context, but I think it's a market fundamentalism of the neoliberalism where it is uncritical worship of markets, right? And assuming that they offer a solution to every single problem. And that's where the center left parties or these centrist, they only offer to mild down this economic distress that neoliberalism offered. They did not challenge the fundamental premise of neoliberal economic order. And that's where I think you mentioned Clinton, Blair, and so forth. So in this scenario, rising inequality, the rise of oligarchs, you cannot have uh, the more sophisticated form of liberal democracy where you keep the discourse of pluralism, multiculturalism. Now, immigrants have been scapegoated, and uh, radical, every anyone who disagrees with the the hegemonic right-wing ideology is now labeled as radical left. And coming from Pakistan, we can relate to that, right? So whenever you want to discredit someone, you frame them as anti-state. So recently, one example, one of the congressperson uh, was made a tweet, and then a Republican senator said we should go back or deport her, right? She's an American naturalized citizen. So this is unheard of. I mean, it's more like maybe we are bringing this uh, negative thing with us from Pakistan, right? I'm just a joke, right? We try to escape that, but now we're in the US and we're noticing similar trends. So yeah, liberal democracies in doldrums, and I think these two are key factors, among others. Yes.
Okay, let me bring Raza in. Raza, one thing which Sadia alluded to is immigration, that this rising immigration, which has brought in this onslaught of rightist movements all across Europe and America. And do you think they are justified in the sense, because if you look at the history for last since this century started, Afghan war, before that Afghan war was going on, destruction of Iraq, destruction of Syria, Libya, Somalia has been a government-less state for I think 50 years. There's no government, and etc. The what happened in Philippines and Libya, the way Libya was dismembered. We don't support this lifelong dictators, but the way these governments were destroyed or were replaced by the West led to uh, relatively progressive, in the sense that I think the women and children and people had a little bit more rights than Saudi Arabia or other places. But that led to this rising tide of immigrants. Like if you break something, they actively broke the whole that region, and Europe took the brunt of it because it's connected by land, so people get there. So isn't it a scapegoating? And is there our failure that our center left or left, that nobody points out that you broke it, you own it?
Thank you, Omar Saab, and thank you for PPF for organizing this. I think you answered your question yourself, with the scapegoating of the immigrants, and it's not happening just in the United States with Trumpism, focusing or spotlighting the Mexicans and the Central Americans. But if you look at in Europe as well, and I'll ask Dr. Sadia later to elaborate that because she works on Europe quite extensively. This rising tide of anti-immigrant policies is also linked to the anti-globalization movement that we are, uh, facing or contending with. And alongside, what has also happened is that we also have this rise or revert, we are going back to nationalisms here in what is Make America Great Again, UK leaving Brexit, all these leaving Europe, sorry, and all these different dimensions of political behavior indicate that somehow we many countries are going back to the raw and toxic idea of a nationalism. In India, you can see with Narendra Modi using the same ideas. In in Turkey, Erdogan also employs this trope. In Hungary, in many other parts, wherever you have rise in authoritarian populism, you see this recourse to nationalist ideas and nationalist rhetoric. And I think I will pick up from where Danish and Sadia left. Is that we really have to go much deeper into this issue of income and wealth inequality, because the levels of inequality, for example, in the US, are perhaps the highest after a century or so. I mean, it has never been that unequal, with top 1% owning or controlling 40 to 50% of wealth, and with the bottom 50% not getting anything. I mean, just one factoid says it all, that two-thirds of Americans do not have any kind of savings to rely upon if they face an emergency. Now, this is world's most powerful, richest nation, and this kind of economic disempowerment and anxiety is what is encashed by populists like
And
Donald Trump. And
it's also
whether
said that this will be the first generation in America which will do worse than the last one. Usually in
yes,
America in last 200 years, every generation did better than the last generation.
yeah,
This will be
I
the
mean,
first one.
exactly. I mean, I don't want to go into the Gini coefficients, but if you even look at that, the US has the much, much higher, I mean, compared to Europe, Canada, Australia, all the advanced so-called developed countries, the US is most unequal. And therefore, one of the theories, now, of course, this is also open to debate. I mean, this has been said many a time about how far income and wealth inequalities are playing into this rise of right-wing authoritarian, political ideas. But I think ideology is also, and that's where nationalism sort of comes into play, because this whole idea of locking the country, building the walls, and deciding who's native and who's not is a project that we see everywhere. I mean, even in Pakistan, what we've done to Afghan refugees in the past few years, the way they have been labeled and forcibly sent back to a very, very insecure, violent environment, and women, girls who were studying in schools were also forced to leave. So it's a kind of a global thing. I mean, we just can't focus on US alone, or for that matter Europe. I mean, in India is doing the same to Bangladeshis who came into Assam, Northeast, and other northeastern states. So I think these two particular factors are leading to what we call a decline or retreat of liberal democracy. Now, the thing is that there are many people who would say, why should we really care? Because ultimately, what was liberal democracy doing? Was it really serving the people well? Was it creating a better society, a better alternative? And I think that is a question that needs to be interrogated as well, because the way the idea of democracy, or corporate democracy, as some on the left call it, has been hijacked by oligarchs, special interests. Just the way we are seeing tech billionaires controlling the U.S. government and its policy in the years to come. I mean, again, is was the system inherently giving way or openings to such elite capture? And I think that particular lack of faith in institutions, democratic institutions, regulatory institutions, redistributive institutions, is the primary reason. And that's why we really have to now reimagine what sort of a democracy. I mean, are we talking about a social democracy? Are we talking about redistributive democracy, an inclusive political system? Because the models that we followed, I mean, globally, I mean, in South Asia, we of course inherited that from the British after 1947, the Westminster model of democracy, and even India has turned that into an illiberal model, just like Turkey or other parts. And do we really, I mean, is that really working for the people, for the greatest good of the greatest number? I think those questions really have to be asked and interrogated in the coming years, or perhaps
Well,
months.
let's
Because
ask. We have Sadia here, who is based in US and also Europe. She is in Italy, where there's a lot of right-wing support now, and she lives in Greece, where she has come across the real problem of immigrants and all this thing. And she brought the question that what's the alternative to liberal democracy, which you also raised, Raza. So, what do you think? What is the alternative? Is it just this going to be nationalistic, fascistic governments which are blaming the immigrants, and very soon even that will wither away, because unless they have a redistributive society where there is less inequality, there's more redistribution. Thomas Piketty with his 15% or 10% global wealth tax. So, so making without getting out of the confines of democracy, reforming it so people do not feel, because in the end, I think, and you can disagree, that everything is economic. If you won't change the economy of people, these hatreds will keep on increasing.
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, what I would recommend is that people look at Samuel Moyn's book, Liberalism Against Itself, which I think I've been reading, and partly because I've been since this winter, I've been having some conversations with some of my friends, and I've been thinking about writing about the statement that I hear a lot from my academic friends when they say liberal democracy has failed. And I got very irritated with that sentence. I get irritated easily, I should say. That's also partly growing up in Pakistan, and then living in America would irritate the hell out of anyone anyway. And so part of it is, I was like, what the hell does that actually mean? Liberal democracy has failed. I mean, what are the alternatives? I mean, are we talking about imperial, like empire hasn't failed? Do we want empire? What do we actually want, right? So, and what I'm trying to say here is, I want to talk about the complicity of the academic left in some of this problem, right? That's not directed at you, Mr. Farooq, but when you said, when I was slightly tongue in cheek when I said आप जॉन लॉक पे भी पहुंच गए और फिर आप मार्क्स पे भी आ गए, तो फिर वो भी बहुत अच्छा है, मगर फिर अगर आपने जॉन लॉक और मार्क्स की बात करनी है तो फिर मिल को क्यों छोड़ दिया बीच में, तो पूरी इंटेलेक्चुअल हिस्ट्री कर लेते हैं, right? So my point was actually, what I was trying to get at is, right, and Moyne is interesting on this, is that there is an Enlightenment conception of freedom as well, and part of let's say, loosely speaking, let's take our own notion of how we're going to do this. And the Enlightenment is thoroughly bankrupt because it's very also tied up to colonialism and race. We understand this. Having said that, whatever we have right now is we need to figure out some structure of governance. And I'm not signing on to John Locke's notion of private property as the condition for individual franchise, but we have to have some notion of politics which gives the majority and without majoritarianism, but people some kind of control over their political lives that is both just and equal, right? And that also honors their freedom. So let's say those are loose conditions, right, for it. And where there's also accountability for a kind of, let's say, creep towards inertia and power, towards the inertial tendencies of power. In that structure, like right now, all we seem to have is liberal democracy now, and within liberal democracy, we also have to fold in social democracy to think about what Raza was saying. Somebody like Moyne would argue that, ironically, the post-World War II dispensation, while destroying and hollowing out liberal democracy from within itself, was also one of the moments, at least in the West and in Europe, that also had one of the most emancipatory, economically speaking, democratic dispensations, because it also had the welfare state, right? Which for Europe at least was a good thing. It was also,
which is based on a lot of colonial exploitation from all over the world.
Whatever it was, but it was, as I was going to continue to say, it was also something that was fundamentally predicated upon denying precisely those structures through things like structural adjustment and also the complete destruction in the Cold War to colonial decolonizing countries. Hence, and Moyne's argument is that Cold War liberalism is what destroyed that even at home, that precisely the Cold War destruction of decolonizing countries was what destroyed liberal democracy even at home. That is one of the axes of destruction, right? Having said all of that, so what I'm trying to say is, but having said that, as a conceptual entity, it's still meaningless to say that that liberal democracy has failed, because all we can say is that it was never allowed to function, right? I mean, but we don't have an alternative, so I don't know what it means to say that it's failed. All we
Let's
can say
bring
is that it's
Danish.
not.
We have just 7 more minutes. Let's bring Danish back in. Uh, do you agree that there's no alternative, like China, which is rising? China has it's an authoritarian kind of democracy, if you call it, from the liberal sense, but they have been able to bring record number of people out of poverty. There's record number of tourists who go out of China, and nobody stays overseas. So about 150 million people go out of China every year, and they come back, and nobody wants to leave China. So there's a model, not based on liberal democracy, but the socialist, communist, whatever you want to call, but it is delivering for the people, and seems like people are generally happy. So do you think there is an alternative, maybe not exactly China, a little bit different, but are there any alternatives, or we need to fine tune this liberal democracy?
That's a fascinating question. I think for sure, I mean, as an optimist, we can never say there cannot be any alternative, but are any existing state structures or political structures seem uh, attractive to me? I would say no, right? I mean, there are obviously some positives and advantages of certain uh, state structures and political structures. So, yeah, in terms of economic development, the success of China cannot be disentangled with the global regime of capitalist accumulation, right? So it's a part and parcel of the global capitalism. But where it really did well as compared to other countries, that uh, it did not engage in market fundamentalism like other countries, where it was more attuned to managing the chaos of market in a way that they climb up the economic development ladder, and all those achievements about uh, putting people out of poverty, they are, I mean, especially for the global south, they are something to consider. But in terms of political freedom, and especially in terms of emancipation of individual, I don't think that they offer an alternative, or at least even if the Chinese state project does not claim to offer any alternative. If you look at their engagement in BRI or even CPEC, they're primarily interested in engaging in economic development, infrastructure development, and so forth, right? So here there's a Cold War going on, but the Chinese side is not offering any ideological alternative, right? And this brings me back to the earlier discussion about the relative uh, decline of liberal democracies tied to this change in the global economy with the rise of China and BRICS, right? So now there's a relative decline of US hegemony worldwide. And economic nationalism cannot be solely understood via domestic factors. These are the international factors which also play a critical role, looking inward and trying to reindustrialize, right? So here's also, especially as a progressive economist, these are interesting times. Progressive economists, socialist economists, whichever way you like, you mentioned Piketty. And again, as a critical scholar, I'm aware that the term progress has that teleological colonial connotation as well. So, but for the lack of better word, right? So, uh, tariffs or using state intervention to steer economy has been the argument of the left. But now the way Trump administration is using it, it needs to be critically assessed, because is it to create employment or empowerment of working people, or it has some broader geostrategic interest, which are like part of the Cold War 2.0? Because in the past Trump administration, there were tax cuts for the billionaire and the oligarch, right? So there's nothing to suggest that the working class, even in the US, including white working class, will benefit from the current economic policies, at least at the moment. Now, in terms of the alternative, I think, again, uh, in terms of possibilities, I think we need to look at the solidarity and grassroots movements at the local level, right? So, which is not very fancy, but I think we need to focus local in our communities to build those alternatives and then think of something at a macro level, but start from the micro level and like workers owned and managed cooperatives or democracy at workplace, right? So you mentioned, Raza, you mentioned what kind of democracy? What about economic democracy where people are not just allowed to vote every 5 years to pick who's the lesser evil, but also decide where they spend most of their adult life, i.e., the workplace, right? Can we be empowered at our workplaces, right? What kind of system would allow that? In fact, even in China, does not allow workers are overworked, squeezed. U.S. again, instead you show up at work, there's a boss who tells you what to do. This seems doesn't seem like a democracy to me, right? So can we reimagine the firm, the enterprise? So democracy at workplace, at community level. I think that's where our focus should be.
Let's ask Raza. Raza, you are in US and you are seeing what roller coaster ride in last 2 3 weeks there has been. There's so much thrown up, but I've lived in US also, and the way I understand, it's opening salvo. Trump is throwing a lot of things, but a lot of things are not just generally the possibility of deporting 12 million people. They say 21 million people, 12 million, even 6 million people is is not possible. The way US system works, the way courts work, and all these other executive orders which they're doing, do you think in next 6 months uh, a lot of courts may reverse these things, and slowly maybe Democrats are going to develop some uh, alternate to whatever is going on and organize and start resisting? Because right now there is a fear and there is this overwhelming sense that Trump is omnipotent, he can do everything. Do you think that within 6 months, once resistance and courts and all this come in, that idea will go down?
I think that's a very optimistic view that I've been reading about and hearing from people. I think we should not make any mistake. By the events have shaped up in a manner that this is truly a majoritarian authoritarian moment in the United States. Trump has not only the two houses with him, majorities there, but the US Supreme Court, he has personally picked up most of the judges, the Republican judges. So ultimately, whatever the courts may block at the federal level or at the state level is ultimately going to go to the Supreme Court. And there, Trump is more likely to get the backing that he is requiring. Maybe after 2 years, when there's a midterm election, the situation may change. But in the absence of what Danish earlier mentioned, in the absence of the local organizing of deliberative democracy at the grassroots level by the opponents, which are, i.e., the Democrats, it's not even going to happen that way because the Democrats, I mean, that is the most ironic thing that, they have lost support of segments of the working people. We see the voting trends. They've also lost the support of many communities of color because there have been more Latinos, etc., voting for Trump in the last election. And despite the fact that many of their compatriots are being deported or at least face the threat of deportation. So this particular moment is not something to be taken lightly that, somehow the US, the conventional argument is that the US has a very strong system of checks and balances and it autocorrects and it checks abuse of power, abuse of executive power. I think this particular moment is going to defy this conventional wisdom. And that is why this is requires urgent necessity of both organizing at the local level, but also the Democratic Party reorganizing itself and reimagining what it can do in the 21st century, because
But
its
do you
old
think
playbook is dead.
whatever Trump is doing, would it deliver to his constituency, the Midwest, the white working class? Would it solve? Because he's not addressing the basic issues.
The populists don't really care about that, So he comes into office and he signs a plethora of executive orders. He just signed an executive order ban saying that we'll go to the plastic straws because plastic is good. Paper straws is woke. Is the idea of Democrats. I mean, I'm giving you a very minor, facetious example, but this is what his support base loves. And don't forget that the rise of Trumpism or rise of other authoritarian ideologies across the globe have been facilitated by big tech as well. The big tech, in particular, the technology big technology controlled social media platforms, are now influencing people far more than legacy media, whether it's India, whether it's the US, whether it's Pakistan, and other parts. So people have been looking at how influencers and YouTubers and podcasters here in the United States have influenced the voters' behavior far more than what the traditional media that used to be the source of information, etc. And that's why Trump's victory was came as a, I mean, this victory came as a big surprise to many, once again, to many pundits on national on the US TV and
And
the major newspapers. So this is the environment, what is known as the alt, the post-truth, alt news, all these different propaganda, etc., etc. I mean, that's playing a very major role. So people who live in that bubble, for them, a lot of these kind of uh, representational or emotional things about throwing non-white people out, controlling the population demographic balance, working against the so-called fictitious great replacement theory matters a lot. This is why they like Trump, and this is why they want Trump to do the things that he's doing. At least he will deliver that sort of thing. Yes, whether it turns into economic betterment, well-being, that remains to be seen.
I think, and with all these tech
Sadia wants to
tools,
say something.
pardon?
May I say, may I say
Oh
something?
yeah, Sadia, please. We have very little time.
I know, I just want to, but I do want to say a couple of things. One of which is, I mean, I want to agree with something Danish said, which is, I'm saying, given the about liberal democracy, that given what we have right now, I'm not sure we have alternatives. I'm in no way saying that we may not be able to invent something for the future. I always want to say that we might be able to, and I hope people do. Having said that, I mean, I do want to say something to something Reza is saying, which is that our audience is largely Pakistani, right? I'm assuming. And I think that there's a tendency amongst Pakistanis in the diaspora or elsewhere to romanticize Pakistan. So I take Reza's point to romanticize the United States and think that the checks and balances are okay and everything will take care of itself. It won't. The US has a very, 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 very dark history. And it's a history that it would behoove Pakistanis to read, right? And to get familiarized themselves. And what we're seeing actually in the election, and I study American history as well, very much so, and it is a history that it would be good for the Pakistanis in the diaspora and elsewhere to familiarize themselves with. We are seeing a kind of, let's say, a kind of resurfacing of America's racial and so on history. We should not be sanguine. Anything can happen. Having said that, the Democrats may not be able to hold us back. I also want to say there is deep resistance right now, and it's coming from quarters that have survived this country. Black quarters, organizational quarters, that is happening. And we also have to pay attention to it. It may not be the Democrats, it may not be parties, but please pay attention and please, go out there and look for those quarters. I'm aware of those groups. I'm working with some of them. I'm paying attention to them. Pakistanis don't know a lot about it. Familiarize yourself with that history, but also look for those people. They do exist. It is happening, but it's not happening in the usual quarters.
And this is where why we have formed this Pakistan Progressive Forum, that people, especially in the diaspora in Europe, we can inform them, and we are trying to make our website where people can connect to all these groups and get more help with organizing if they want to organize or learn. If they want to learn. And to Raza's point with this social media, and all the stops have been taken away by these tech bros on social media. So now we will have even more onslaught. But in any case, unfortunately, I would have loved to bring Danish into ending moment, but we are run out of time. So I hope we had a very thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion, and we'll continue these series of online conferences. And I thank you all, Raza, Sadia, Danish, for participating, and hope to have you and continue this discussion in future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for